Okay. That's the next question. I mean, how do you view Mayor Koch's efforts?
In the beginning, it was very weak.
Okay.
Whatever Mayor Koch said, he was excoriated by uh, the gay community for his indifference. Um, his commissioner of health was a man named David Senser,
Yes.
who had previously been the head of the aforementioned CDC,
Hmm.
uh, and he was not a bad man at all. But he had essentially been eased out of his job at the CDC because he had touted he had touted the swine flu epidemic of the late 1970s, and the CDC projected this huge epidemic. You know, we have a swine flu epidemic now.
Yes.
They produced, as a consequence, not as a consequence, but along with it, a vaccine was produced, and we were all advised very strongly to get immunized. I remember getting a shot. You know, there was a lot of coverage of that, and this is going to be a terrible epidemic, and you wanted to protect yourself. I was pretty young, but everyone was supposed to get it, the swine flu epidemic never materialized, and B, the vaccine turned out to be not harmless. So there were very negative side effects. People who a small proportion of people got neurological disorders like Tourette's syndrome,
Hmm.
and so he was burnt by that. So when he, as commissioner of health of the city of New York, having been burnt by the swine flu, he really dragged his feet because he didn't want to be burnt again. Uh, and Koch did not, who was a strong mayor in many ways, did not provide leadership, did not push the issue, uh, and basically spurned the demands of the gay community in the early days. The gay men's health crisis was created very early in the 80s, and he really didn't work with them. And as a consequence, almost all the efforts in those early days, in the say the first half of the 80s, most of those efforts were private efforts in the gay community, creating things like the gay men's health crisis, which was a response to the epidemic by some well-to-do or well-placed gay men who were seeing their friends die and felt that they had to both publicize the epidemic, not only to caution these people, but within the gay community. It was uh, and start providing services. Historically, in the 80s, there was a lot of resistance. I think that's just kind of a critical term to the epidemic in all kinds of ways. People just, at each stage, didn't want to believe what they were seeing in this epidemic. And one example I gave you was that even though doctors saw, or scientists saw, that both gay men and drug addicts were coming down with this disease, they only wanted to see this as a gay disease. And it took over a year for them to begin to see that this was not just a gay disease, that the IV drug users who were getting the disease were not gay necessarily. And that kind of resistance is a leitmotif in the first decade. And the gay community itself was very, very reticent. Um, they felt, many of them, in response to gay public health physicians or physicians who were warning them that these doctors were, let me think of the black community, that
Hmm.
these doctors were basically taking the side of the oppressor, that they were, through public health, trying to take away the thing that had created, that they take away what the 70s had created, which was a vibrant gay community with baths and all kinds of sexual institutions. It was kind of a public renaissance of gay sexuality, and this was and these school norms were trying to destroy that. And so, it took a while for the gay community itself to get the message. I think when the death rate was so high in places like New York and San Francisco that I think that was very important for many people to see that. And then they went the other way to see this was important, and then people panicked, as you can imagine. So Koch in the early years was not a leader. The Department of Health was not a leader. And even when the Department of Health began to become involved in the epidemic after 1985, in certain ways they were very slow to respond. One of the things I remember is, and there were some very important people from Colombia involved in this, again, resistance. The people within the Department of Health argued that this was a disease that could not be transmitted to women, or it was very rare for it to be transmitted to women, that this is primarily a male disease. Again, that was resistance.
Mm-hmm.
The first woman with HIV/AIDS was identified in August, I can't remember exactly, 1982 or 1983. But given the epidemiology of the disease, women started appearing with the disease somewhat later, and that's been true in other, in the African countries I've studied, and in Europe.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so if you could describe the AIDS crisis or the AIDS phenomenon as one certain thing, only one, would you pick it to be? Would you pick it to be a medical issue, a social issue, or a political issue?
All of the above.
Okay.
An epidemic is never a single thing. An epidemic is a complex social event like a war, especially an epidemic in a marginalized community. It's and I don't know which it becomes first. It's clear if it's an epidemic of a disease, we use epidemic rather broadly. Of course, it's a medical issue. Does it necessarily come first? No, not necessarily. It's a political issue for the reasons that we talked about. That an epidemic requires resources. It requires the response of the community and of government agencies. And those agencies will be committed, and because of the politics of the epidemic, the kind of response will be because of the politics of the epidemic, and the politics will change over time, as is always the case, and was certainly the case in the AIDS epidemic. I remember I was working on a different project having to do with New York City in about 88, 89, and spoke to an ex-commissioner of health under the Wagner administration, Leona Baumgartner. And she was married to a very famous epidemiologist from the CDC, one of the founders of the CDC. And he picked me up at the airport and drove me to their home. And he was complaining about how the AIDS epidemic was different because it was political. And so for epidemiologists, they just wanted to see this as a scientific issue. But any epidemic, including the coronary heart disease epidemic, is political because